Hello everyone. This week we're going to talk about labor markets. Now, labor markets are unique among markets for a number of reasons, and we're going to start out this class by talking about some of those reasons. I'm going to follow that up by presenting a very simple model of labor markets that should look familiar to all of you. And then we're going to talk about some of the reasons why wages differ between occupations and labor markets. Beyond that, we'll get into some complications that are sometimes modeled, but not modeled in the simple way that we're going to approach it today. And then a broader discussion about some contemporary issues in labor markets. So, what makes labor markets different? I think this was most succinctly summed up by one of my favorite economists, Karl Polanyi, when he said, "Workers are not cucumbers." The simple fact is that if a number of cucumbers go unsold, the consequence is some spoiled cucumbers. But when workers go unhired, there are major social consequences of this. And so we need to think about labor markets as being different because of that. But despite this, formally, we most often treat labor as another commodity. So employers demand labor, they're trying to maximize their benefit, profit. Workers supply labor and seek to maximize their benefits, in this case, utility. And so the graphs look exactly like the supply and demand graphs we've been working with up to this point, except for quantity becomes employment and price becomes wage. We treat workers just like commodities in our simplified model, but it gets progressively more complicated, but that's a story for another day. First, let's talk about the firm's decision to hire. The firm looks at two things. It looks at the marginal revenue product that a worker will generate for the firm. And so that's the amount that a unit of additional labor contributes to the revenues of the firm. And so this is essentially what the firm gains by hiring one additional worker, a marginal worker. The firm also incurs costs, right? So they have to pay wages to the worker, and that's called marginal factor costs. And that's the amount that a unit of labor adds to the firm's costs. So these be wages, benefits, hiring costs, all those sorts of things. Generally speaking, because we assume diminishing marginal productivity, which is analogous to our idea of diminishing marginal utility, that means that as you add additional workers to a firm, assuming that they aren't also adding additional machines to the firm, productive capital, each worker is going to contribute less and less towards total productivity. So the first worker might produce 100 units of output. The second might only produce 50, 25, 10, and so on, right? The simple idea here is like the idea of too many cooks in the kitchen. If you've got a fixed amount of pots, pans, and stoves, and you add more and more people to a kitchen, you're not going to get a linear relationship in terms of increased output with number of increased cooks. This generally means that the marginal factor cost is going to be less than the marginal revenue product for the first worker, and the second and the third, and so on. And the firm is going to keep hiring more and more workers until the marginal revenue product declines such that marginal factor cost is equal to marginal revenue product for that worker. So that tells the firm how many workers to hire, is they will just keep hiring until they reach that point where marginal factor cost is equal to marginal revenue product. The individual faces a different problem than the firm. The individual that's deciding to work is deciding how to divide their time between competing aims. They could do paid work, they could do unpaid work at home, they could pursue education to improve their skills so they might earn a higher wage in the future, they could engage in leisure, or they could engage in self-employment. And so workers are seeking to maximize their happiness or their utility by dividing their time between these 5 pursuits. So the main two we should think about here, though, is paid work and leisure. We'll just kind of simplify it down and think that the worker is only choosing between those two things. And so here we have a individual's labor supply curve. And it's got this strange backwards bending shape. And the reason this is there is just like with demand for commodities, there's a substitution effect and an income effect that act in opposite directions here. At the lower part of the curve, where the substitution effect is stronger, as wages increase, the incentive for paid work becomes greater, and it makes it relatively preferable to the other aims. But beyond a certain point, you can't induce a person to work more hours by just paying them more. That person will feel richer, and they will want to take more leisure time. And this, we can think of this as relating to our earlier idea of diminishing marginal utility. There's a diminishing marginal utility to paid labor and to leisure. And so if that's out of balance, there's too much paid work, then the worker would prefer to substitute towards leisure. And so that's why we have this backwards bending effect where beyond a certain wage rate, an individual worker may choose to work less rather than more. This would seem somewhat problematic, but even if all of the individual labor supply curves in a market are backwards bending like that, if we sum up a bunch of individual backwards bending labor supply curves, as long as they aren't identical curves, which they aren't likely to be because individuals have different preferences on the labor-leisure trade-off, and if we have the possibility of more people being drawn into this labor market due to the high wage rate, then we should still get a normal upward sloping labor supply curve. Another important thing to keep in mind here is that we can calculate an elasticity of labor supply. It's just like calculating any other elasticity of supply. And that describes how the labor force participation rate changes as the wage rate changes. And that's defined by the shape and slope of our curve. On the other side of the market, on the demand side, it's a little more straightforward because we don't have this weird labor-leisure trade-off thing going on. When wages are high, employers have an incentive to economize on the use of labor. So they have an incentive to try to use other inputs, typically in this scenario when I think about capital. So they will either increase automation of the job by purchasing more capital, or they may cut production in response to high wages. And so that gives us the logic for the downward sloping labor demand curve. So labor demand will tend to be relatively wage elastic if there are good substitute inputs available. So if we think about a scenario where a job is easy to automate, then labor demand will be wage elastic. It'll be very sensitive. But if that job is very difficult to automate, or it's very difficult to train people to do that job, then it's going to be a lot more inelastic. So labor demand will tend to be relatively inelastic if there are no good substitutes. Having kind of laid out the logic of that, we're going to have our normal downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, but they're demand and supply curves for labor rather than goods. Here is a very simple model. Should look exactly like the models you've seen before. But let's focus on the story for a moment. Think about the labor market for real estate agents around the 2008 housing crisis. There is a housing crisis. No one is buying houses because they can't get credit, so they have less and less need for real estate agents. So the demand curve for real estate agents shifts inward. And as a result, we see that the wage rate falls and the number of people employed as real estate agents also falls. And so this is a simple way that we can use the basic logic of supply and demand to say some things about labor markets. Let's do one more story. Whenever I was first beginning undergraduate studies, there was a huge push to get people to major in pre-pharmacy because there was this major advertising push by firms that hired a lot of pharmacists that they weren't able to fill jobs, that we were going to have a shortage of pharmacists. And so this induced many more people to study pharmacy. Keep in mind here that pharmacists are a very highly trained group whose jobs often cannot be automated by law. Like, even if you've got a pill sorting robot, that robot has to be overseen and all of those prescriptions legally have to be checked by a licensed pharmacist. So this means that both the labor supply and the labor demand curve for pharmacists is very inelastic. It's very steep, as pictured here. What these firms were able to do is by advertising that they were short on pharmacists, that induced more pharmacists to enter the market, that shifted the supply curve outward, which led to them being able to reduce the wage for pharmacists by a large margin. And so this is one way where we can think about the motives of employers using this model. They stand to gain a lot by manipulating the supply and the demand of labor. This is not to say that pharmacists became low-wage workers by any means, just simply that their wage fell or did not rise as much as it otherwise would have. Having gone through a couple of those simple models, where the logic is just the same as the supply and demand models that we've gone before, let's talk about a couple of reasons why some jobs may pay more than others. At the beginning of this section, I talked about how a firm will hire workers until the marginal revenue product of hiring a worker is equal to the marginal factor cost of hiring the worker. And in equilibrium, that will also be the wage rate of the worker. Conceptually, the marginal revenue product of labor is what labor contributes to the productive process. So, because wage rate is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor, in a competitive market, workers get paid exactly as much as they contribute to production. And so, in a very strict interpretation of this perfectly competitive model, the only thing that determines a worker's wage rate is how productive they are. And the only things that determine how productive they are is their human capital. And so human capital is a large number of factors that affect worker productivity. These could be formal education and job-related training, informal education or on-the-job experience, innate talent, or even it extends to the physical and mental health of the worker. So all of these things that can make a worker more productive. So there are some other factors that can affect the worker's pay rate if the market is less than competitive. One of these things is worker effort. So if we are in a scenario where the market is maybe not perfectly competitive, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, how if the market is not perfectly competitive, then there's a higher cost of job loss to the worker. Then pay structures can be changed to help extract worker effort. If there isn't some sort of cost to the worker for being fired, then they may slack off at work and be less productive than the contract stipulated they ought to be. Another factor at play here is something called compensating differentials. So, compensating differentials are this old idea in economics, all the way back to Adam Smith, that a worker has to be paid extra to deal with bad working conditions or other negative job aspects. And they also may be paid less if their job has a lot of positive non-wage aspects. Some examples here. Garbage men are usually paid higher than other similarly skilled workers because parts of their job are disagreeable. On the other side, a lot of people who work in creative pursuits, artists, animators, things like that, are paid less than workers with similar skill levels because their job is seen as kind of innately fulfilling to them in some degree, and people are willing to accept that low wage rate to have the opportunity to work in those industries. And so this is the idea of compensating differentials. Crucially, and something that we'll talk about at length here, is that most labor markets are not actually competitive. Labor markets are most often monopsonistic or oligopsonistic. Now, both of those words probably sound similar to words you're familiar with. While a monopoly is when there's only one seller of something, a monopsony is when there's only one purchaser of something. Similarly, while oligopoly is whenever there's only a few sellers of something, oligopsony is when there's only a few purchasers of something. Both of these confer market power onto the employer. Think of it very simply. Let's imagine that you are a coal miner in a West Virginia coal town. There's one employer, it's the coal company. If the wage rate is dropped due to the remoteness of where you live, you are not going to be able to find employment with a different employer. There's only one employer, it's the coal company. And so that means that the coal company can push wages down. This is a particularly stark example, but workers are often divided up into labor markets where only a few employers are hiring workers with those particular skills. And so even though they may not be the only employer, if there's a few, that can then still result in a lower wage rate. One way that workers respond to this is through unions. One way to see unions is a way for workers to establish monopoly power over the supply of labor in response to employer power over the demand for labor. This is the idea of countervailing power. If you've got one large powerful entity, it can create inefficiencies and abuses, but if you have another powerful entity that pushes back against them, then you can reach a better outcome. The classic story that many economists have told for decades is that unions increase wages for a few workers at the expense of creating many more workers that can no longer get a job, unemployed. This conventional wisdom seems to be overturning as more and more empirical research shows that most labor markets are in fact not competitive, because we don't have those reductions of employment if the market is not competitive, or at least not to the same degree. Another series of models that have been made about the labor market that we won't dig into deeply are the efficiency wage model and dual labor markets model. Let's start with the efficiency wage model. So in this model, workers may shirk at work, and so one way to induce a worker to work harder at work is to pay them above the going market rate for the wage. And this isn't just some feel-good thing in the logic of the model. It's not saying, hey, I'm going to pay you $5 more per hour, and in exchange you'll work harder. No. The logic of the model is that now that worker is receiving $5 more than they could at any other firm in that market. And as a result, if they shirk and get fired, then the cost of that job loss is more than if they were being paid just the market rate. If the employer only paid the market rate, then that worker could be fired and find a job at an equivalent wage rate at a different firm very quickly, particularly if the market is mostly competitive. In this model, the employer paying above the equilibrium rate also raises the market wage rate above equilibrium, which leads to unemployment, leads to a surplus of workers, in addition to this increased cost of job loss that enforces work and effort and prevents shirking. Another model that's a little less formal is the dual labor markets model. And so in this model, there's a primary sector where workers kind of get a good compensation bundle, and that's separate from a secondary sector where workers have lower wages, low opportunities for advancement, and little job security. We can think about this as being divvied up along education levels, as for one, but in kind of we can think about it as discriminatory labor markets. For instance, women were systematically excluded from many professions, and the professions that were made available to them for decades and decades paid less. This is even true to some extent today. And that is one phenomenon that can be modeled in a dual labor market model. It is also the case that racial discrimination in the South limited Black Americans from being employed in certain industries, and the industries that they could become employed in were separated and had lower wage rate. the dual labor markets model has some overlap with ideas, or with the ideas we might have about discrimination in labor markets, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. So one thing I want to hit upon in this chapter is the divergence between worker productivity and the median wage. Here on this graph, we see the black line, which is corporate profits. And we can see that they've grown a huge amount over time. And a large amount of that increase in profits has been a result of workers becoming more productive. But the blue line here is median weekly wages. So they find the person in the middle of the income distribution, and that's the median wage, right? And this is a real wage, so it's adjusted for inflation over the years. And we can see that all the way from about 1980 to nearly present, the median weekly wage has been stagnant. If labor markets were truly competitive, then as worker productivity increased, the median wage should have also increased at a similar rate. But that's not what we're seeing, which once again lends credence to the notion that most labor markets are not in fact competitive. And this divergence between productivity and wages has major implications for income and wealth inequality down the road, something that we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. Another important topic whenever we're talking about labor markets is labor market discrimination. And this can happen through a number of ways. So let's define it real quick. Labor market discrimination is when similarly qualified people are treated disadvantageously in employment based upon race, sex, age, sexual preference, physical appearance, or disability. And so it's basically some observable characteristic about an individual leads them to be treated differently in labor markets. The two main ways that this kind of manifests is through pay gaps and occupational crowding. Occupational crowding is the idea where people that share one of these kind of characteristics may be crowded into one single industry where they are paid less. And this is closely related to this idea of dual labor markets. Pay gaps is another way to look at it, and that's where two people doing the same job that are similarly qualified are paid differently. And we often see this one presented particularly when it comes to gender pay gaps. And you may have heard a wide array of estimates of the gender pay gap, anywhere from, I believe, 70 cents on the dollar to that it doesn't exist. Crucially, it's important that we know the difference between a controlled for and an uncontrolled for pay gap. An uncontrolled pay gap simply looks directly at total earnings of women and total earnings of men and directly compares them. And in this uncontrolled way, we get the largest estimates of the pay gap that are down around 70 cents on the dollar. If you start controlling for things, if you control for the fact that women select different jobs than men and the difference in qualifications, that pay gap tends to shrink. This is not to say that the pay gap isn't real, and also we should look very critically at why women are crowded into a particular profession, or why people of a specific racial group are crowded into a specific profession, because they may not be choosing that. And so it's not to say that controlled for or uncontrolled for measures are, one is better than the other. It's just there are different measures that we should be aware of, and that's why you may have heard many different estimates of the gender pay gap. I think the last issue that I want to talk about in labor markets is immigration. Major hot button issue. But let's stick very closely to what the empirical research says about it. And what the empirical research says is that immigration has a number of pros and cons for a domestic economy. One important note is that immigrants do not typically compete for the same jobs that U.S. residents do. And this means that oftentimes, especially for, say, middle-class Americans, an influx of immigrants into the community does not affect their employment or their wage rate. But it does affect the employment and wage rate of low-wage workers. So those workers do suffer falling employment and wages. Think framing carpentry, landscapers, things like that. These are like the classic markets where influx of immigrants, documented or not, doesn't matter, has resulted in many Americans suffering lower employment or lower wages. You'll hear time and time again, and this has been empirically verified, immigrants on average contribute more in taxes than they consume in government benefits because they lack eligibility for most government benefits, whether documented or not. And interestingly, immigrants also tend to be good for innovation. They are more likely to file for patents than native-born residents, and they also are more likely to start businesses. Now, this brings up the topic of instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is the idea that the evaluation of whether immigration is good or bad should be determined based on its effects for people and the governments of the country that they are moving to. It's easy to lose sight if you're working in that instrumentalist framework. It's very easy to lose sight of the fact that these are human beings. And especially when workers are undocumented, they are often very easily exploited. They can be paid below the minimum wage rate. They lack the same legal protections that documented workers may receive because they might be afraid of reporting unsafe working conditions to the proper authorities because they're afraid of being deported. And so it's always important to keep in mind that these people are indicating a preference for working in the country they're moving to, documented or not, and they're doing that even with all of these downsides. And we should recognize the downsides that these people face and the particular human impact of not having recourse if you have an unsafe working environment or your wages are being stolen. I implore you to think about immigration and its impact on labor markets in a broader context than just simply what happens to the domestic worker. So, wrapping things up. We can model labor markets much like other markets, but some complications exist that make the model less applicable. There are models that address market power, efficiency, wages, and dual labor markets, but those are things that you'll talk about if you take a labor economics class down the road. Real median wage has been stagnant for 40 years, and this has had major implications for inequality. Labor market discrimination is a concern that manifests in different ways and has been empirically shown to exist over and over again. And finally, immigration has several effects that creates winners and losers, immigrants and domestic workers, and we should think about immigration and its impact on labor markets more broadly than just its effect on domestic workers. All right, I think that's all I got for this week. Thanks.